Does Vladimir Putin care about the costs of war? Russia is not a democracy, at least not in the fullest sense. A common way political scientists measure democratic institutions is with the polity scale. It ranges from positive 10 for full democracies — Ireland was a full democracy for the time period depicted — to negative 10 for full autocracy, which Saudi Arabia perennially is. By contrast, Russia has seen a lot of variance. After Gorbachev came into power, the Soviet Union's autocratic institutions deteriorated. That process continued under Yeltsin during the birth of the current Russian state, but eventually receded as he partnered with powerful political allies. Putin coming into power initially indicated a change of pace, but eventually that too receded. Since then, Russia has been in a steady state, with some political competition, but nowhere close to a full democracy. He may be somewhat responsive to a sizable group of people, but he does not have to win competitive elections to maintain power. Given that, one might worry that Putin would not internalize the costs of blood and gold in a war against Ukraine. This, in turn, would seem to increase the likelihood of war. And there's a reasonable comparison to draw here from recent history. Saddam Hussein appeared to place little importance on the negative consequences of war when he invaded Kuwait. He was just interested in annexing an oil-rich territory. That, of course, precipitated an international coalition to intervene to liberate Kuwait, and eventually Saddam was forced to retreat. This narrative provides a reasonable explanation for why wars happen. And the current situation between Ukraine and Russia can help illustrate this. Imagine that this white line represents the expected division between Ukraine and Russia in the event of a conflict. Everything to the west is what Ukraine anticipates keeping in the event of war, and everything to the east is what Russia anticipates that it will take. In practice, that division might be more favorable to Ukraine, or it might be more favorable to Russia. This is just the average between all of those possibilities. Fighting is costly, of course, and we can use this yellow line to reflect that. Everything between the yellow and white lines represents what Ukraine expects to pay in costs of loss of life, property destruction, and so forth, converted in terms of territorial area. We can do the same thing with Russia. Everything between the red and white lines represents Russia's costs. As such, any border drawn between the yellow and red lines is mutually preferable to war. That's because such settlements are close to what the expected division would be, but don't come with any costs. In principle, such settlements always exist. It just requires that war be costly. But what if Putin, Russia's central decision-maker, doesn't pay any costs? Obviously, he's not going to be personally fighting the war, and perhaps the expenses will ultimately come out of accounts that he doesn't control. It turns out that even if that were the case, these mutually preferable settlements still exist. Think back to the expected division for a moment. Even if Putin internalizes none of the costs of war, there's still a bargaining space. Now it's just between the yellow and white lines. Where problems actually arise are when a leader has direct benefits for war. That starts pushing all the way up against the opponent's internalized costs. And if those benefits are extreme enough, they push past the opposing cost line. Now the situation explodes. Ukraine needs to have a settlement at least to the east of the yellow line, but Putin needs to have a settlement at least to the west of the red line. That's not possible to do, and so war becomes inevitable. One of the ways a leader can have direct benefits from war is because of the diversion. The Falklands War is often cited as a classic example of this. The Falkland Islands are a British territory, but they are much closer to Argentina, and indeed Argentina has a long-running claim to them. However, there was a lot more to the story when war broke out in 1982. Argentina had a military dictatorship at the time, and they were in the tail end of what is known as the Dirty War, a period where Argentinian security forces killed or disappeared political opponents. Their popularity was faltering. Initiating an interstate conflict seemed like it could provide direct benefits to the regime, while at the same time the leadership was not internalizing the direct costs. By fighting a war, the leadership wanted to rally citizens around the flag and direct any anger or frustration they had to the external British government. This, in theory, would protect the regime from potential political challengers. Such a diversionary theory of conflict is widespread because it is easy to understand what is happening on the surface. But it overlooks a less obvious countervailing incentive that autocratic leaders also face. To explore that, let's look at two case studies. First, the Bush administration and the Iraq War. From 2002 to 2003, the Bush administration made a very public argument that Saddam Hussein was a threat to the international community. The US began mobilizing around the region to prepare for the war, which began on March 20th, 2003. Within a few weeks, the United States had emerged victorious in the interstate portion of the war, and by May 1st, Bush declared an end to major combat operations. In retrospect, we all know how wrong that was. As the Iraq War shifted toward an insurgency, the entire thing became a fiasco for the Bush administration. And by the end of Bush's term, his disapproval rating had shot above 60. And yet, the worst consequence for Bush was that his political party suffered in the 2008 election, losing the presidency and both chambers of Congress. Bush himself has retired to a sprawling ranch, where now he focuses his time on giving speeches and painting. Compare that story arc to Tsar Nicholas II. On June 28, 1914, Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated, thereby beginning the July Crisis. Austria-Hungary issued demands out of Serbia in response. Serbia refused those demands. Austria-Hungary therefore declared war on Serbia, and Russia, seeing itself as a protector of Serbia, declared war on Austria-Hungary in retaliation. Like Bush and the Iraq War, eventually things did not go well for Nicholas here. Protests mounted on the streets, and the Russian Revolution began. The Romanov family was arrested, and after spending some time in prison, revolutionaries eventually executed them. Here we have two leaders, and two very different outcomes. It would be easy to chalk up their forking paths to coincidence, but it actually reflects a broader statistical trend. Among democratically elected leaders, 3% go into exile at the end of their terms. Another 3% go to jail, and only 1% are killed. In sum, most democratic leaders are perfectly fine after they leave office, because democratic institutions protect the peaceful transition of power. The same cannot be said for non-democratic leaders. 23% of them go into exile at the end of their terms, perhaps fearing the fact that 12% go to jail and 7% wind up dead. Summing up, only 7% of democratically elected leaders have bad post-tenure outcomes. It's close to 5 times worse for non-democratic leaders. And this takes us back to Putin. Imagine for a moment we knew the inner workings of the Russian regime. Putin might be safe from potential competitors at the moment. If so, suppose he fought a war and it went poorly. Then he is opening himself up to coup opportunities that would not have existed otherwise. Putin isn't the same level of autocrat that Nicholas II was, but it is easy to construct a situation where the coup eventually lands him in jail. That doesn't mean that starting a war would be impossible for Putin, but it does mean that he would want to be extra cautious. Going back to the bargaining situation at hand, being an autocrat does not inherently mean that you ignore the cost of fighting and shift your demands beyond to what peace can allow, like this here. In fact, it could mean that you internalize the risks of war at a higher rate than an unbiased leader would, meaning that the range of acceptable settlements is even larger. Unfortunately, this cuts both ways. Imagine that Putin already had many opponents that were in good position to remove him from power, similar to the diversionary explanation for the Falklands War. Then fighting for survival suddenly looks like a good idea. Putin would be in grave danger otherwise. With his back against the wall, he would need enormous concessions on the international stage to stay in power. But such demands are infeasible for the opponent, in which case the autocratic incentives only make things worse. For us as outsiders, it is hard to know which of these is the case. Is Putin firmly in power? On the surface, maybe the answer seems to be yes. But it is also possible that there is a deeper power struggle going on behind the scenes that we do not see. And without that knowledge, it is hard to say what Putin's personal biases for war or against war look like. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.